An invisible footprint that no one else saw, and that completely changed the course of a case I thought was closed. What seemed to be a simple death of an elderly man turned into the most baffling mystery of my career. It was a cold day in Santiago when I was called to the scene of an apparently uneventful discovery. Don Julio, 78 years old, found with no visible signs of violence in his apartment. Everything pointed to natural death, a routine procedure for a forensic doctor like me. But something in my instinct told me to look beyond the surface, that the body and the place held secrets not visible at first glance. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. My name is Dr. Ricardo Velasquez. I am 38 years old, and I have been working in forensic medicine here in Santiago for over a decade. In this profession, every detail can be crucial, and what many consider insignificant can be the key that opens up a whole world of hidden truths. Don Julio's story seemed simple, almost monotonous. A man who lived alone, with health deteriorated by age and chronic illnesses that could explain his death. But when I arrived at the apartment and began my usual inspection, something caught my attention. A small stain on the floor, almost imperceptible, accompanied by a partial footprint that did not belong to Don Julio. That footprint was so small and subtle that no one else in the police had noticed it, not even in the first review of the place. But for me, that mark was a spark that ignited an investigation that would take unexpected turns. Throughout this video, I will tell you how a minimal, almost invisible footprint cast doubt on all initial assumptions, revealed lies, and led me to discover a truth that changed not only this case, but the way I approach my work forever. This is not just a story of forensic science, but a story about how persistence, observation, and respect for every detail can make an apparently simple death reveal dark secrets. Stay with me until the end, because what I discovered will surprise you as much as it surprised me. IT was a day that began with the usual routine in the forensic service. We received the body of an elderly man, Don Ernesto, found in his home by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen him for days. When I arrived at the scene, everything seemed to indicate a natural death. There were no visible signs of violence, no disorder in the house, no evidence of struggle or robbery. Simply, an older man, alone, who had likely passed away peacefully. Everything pointed to a cardiac cause or a stoppage typical of old age. What caught my attention initially was the state of calm the corpse showed. His face was serene, with no traces of recent agony. The skin was a bit cold, and there were no bruises or blows. It was a very different scenario from the more common cases I deal with, where violence is almost always a main factor. But just as I was thinking the autopsy would confirm what was expected, something made me stop. While carefully inspecting every part of the body, I applied the habit of not overlooking any detail, and that's when I found that mark. It wasn't an obvious mark, nor was it in an expected place. It was etched, almost imperceptible, in the skin of the neck, just beneath the jawline. It was a small pressure mark, barely detectable to the naked eye. I then approached my colleagues to show it. They were surprised as well. No one had noticed that sign before, and, what was more unsettling, no one had a clear explanation of how it could have gotten there. It turned out the mark corresponded to a symbol, one that did not seem accidental or casual. It was as if someone had pressed an object firmly against that specific spot during the last minutes before death. Analyzing it more closely and consulting files, I remembered that in previous cases, similar marks had been related to attempted strangulation or at least a violent hold on the neck, more subtle than a visible blow, but just as lethal. This clue made my mind start to turn, because now natural death began to seem less likely. I then decided to request additional toxicology tests, and began reviewing security cameras in the area around the probable time of death. It was not common for a neighbor like Don Ernesto to have cameras installed, nor nearby homes with security devices. But this time I wanted to broaden the scope of the investigation. While waiting for the first results, I went over the scene again. Something else caught my attention: the state of the cell phone next to the bed where he was found. It seemed to have been recently handled, and there were no signs of final emergency call, nor a recent message containing a desperate word. When I called the family, they were incredulous. No one could imagine that something dark had occurred. They spoke of Don Ernesto's delicate health, how calm he was, his simple routine. No sign of enemies or people wanting to harm him. That made the discovery of that mark even stranger, along with the possibility that someone had been in his house without anyone knowing. I went back to analyze the mark with the help of a dermatoglyphic specialist. It was unmistakable. The mark had the shape of a ring, with a very particular detail that matched the type of seal used in medicine, one worn by some people working in clinical settings, especially in emergency departments. This led me to review the list of healthcare workers who had visited Don Ernesto in the previous week since, due to his age, he was under constant medical supervision, and possibly someone had been with him at home. I found that one of the nursing assistants providing home health care had recent access to the patient. When I called to talk, I noticed his evasive attitude, but I did not have enough evidence to accuse him or even confront him directly. The work had to be patient and methodical. So I started comparing the fingerprints of the worker with the mark on the deceased's neck, and to my surprise, the mark I had found consisted of a very peculiar ring, which coincidentally matched one he wore. The tension began to rise, but stronger evidence was still needed to support a hypothesis other than natural death. I couldn't afford to make a mistake because justice depended on it, or at least closing a case with the truth only halfway revealed. Several days passed until the toxin test results I requested arrived. The analyses revealed the presence of a compound that, in small doses, is undetectable to an untrained eye but can cause a sudden cardiac arrest if administered at the right moment. The substance was rare, not a common drug one might think of in an accident or overdose scenario. Putting all this information together, the scene that formed in my mind was completely different from what it seemed at first. The ring mark indicated the pressure of an obvious attempt to manipulate the neck. The toxin showed there was intentional poisoning, and the phone not having called anyone confirmed the man's total isolation. Even more so, the nursing assistant's attitude began to make sense in light of these facts. It was then, with the prosecutor's office's consent, that I decided to deepen the investigation around that assistant. It turned out he was far from being a model employee. He had unclear antecedents and previous complaints of mistreatment in other homes where he had worked, although never convicted due to lack of evidence. A shadow hung over him, and the tiny mark that no one had previously noticed was a key to uncovering a hidden truth, the intention to take Don Ernesto's life discreetly, camouflaged as a natural event. The following weeks were full of twists. We discovered communications between the assistant and third parties seeking to manipulate bonds and payments related to the elderly man's pension. What seemed like a simple caregiving contract ended up being a network of deception and breach of trust. Don Ernesto, a fragile man with no close family, ended up being a victim not only of violent death, but also of the systematic abandonment by those who should have cared for his well-being. I never imagined that such a small, almost ignored mark could open the door to such a deep and delicate investigation. That stain on the skin, that trace that seemed insignificant, was the silent voice of a body that was truly telling its story. I reminded myself that day that in forensic medicine, the truth lies in the details, in what seems minimal, in what almost no one wants to see. Reaching this conclusion not only meant solving a case, but also reaffirming the value of working with patience, dedication, and, above all, respect for the bodies that speak to us through their marks, even if they don't scream. I understood that behind every case there is a person, a life, and that my job as a forensic physician goes far beyond technical analyses. It is a bridge for justice to be served and for silenced voices to find their echo. That mark stopped being just a simple trace on the skin and became the door that opened an entire hidden truth beneath the routine's appearance. And sometimes it is those small signs that mark the difference between closing a file and changing the course of an entire life. I never again underestimated those marks invisible to the naked eye, because I understood that in our work, the unexpected is always just around the corner. And that mark, so small and discreet, was what changed everything. What came next was a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries that completely absorbed me. In the routine of my work, one sometimes gets used to facing crimes, tragedies, or accidents, but this case had a much darker shadow. Something that made me question what extent apparent tranquility can conceal the most silent and lethal violence. Once I became aware of the importance of that mark and the toxic compound in Don Ernesto's blood, I decided to delve even deeper into each of the pieces that fit into this intricate web. I contacted the police to have them not only review the route the assistant took through the security cameras, but also to try to trace his communications and movements. However, what was both curious and frustrating at the same time was that he seemed to want to erase any evidence, acting with caution, like someone who knows they are being investigated, but who, at the same time, cannot help but make small mistakes. Remembering the first conversation with the assistant, his evasion seemed to me both a natural defense and a sign of nervousness. This condition was later confirmed when deleted text messages were discovered, hastily erased from his phone, which we were able to partially recover thanks to experts in digital recovery. These messages revealed conversations with people unknown to Don Ernesto, talking about payments, documents that needed to be fixed, and the need to keep things quiet. It was a clear indication that behind this care service, there was something far more corrupt and dangerous. But nothing prepared me for what the investigators found during a search of the suspect's home. In a hidden box, they found small jars with traces of chemical substances similar to those we had detected in Don Ernesto's body. This, combined with documents showing pressing debts and financial exchanges with contacts operating in high-risk areas. It was not something casual or random. It was all part of a network of exploitation and violence that had found its perfect stage in the apparent solitude of an elderly man. Returning to Don Ernesto's house with all this in mind was like viewing the scene from another dimension. I now understood how that barely perceptible mark was actually the sign of an attempt at direct manipulation, as if the person involved had wanted to ensure control over his victim's body, not only with the toxin but physically, at the last moment. It was a kind of violence executed silently, stealthily, until it achieved its devastating effect without leaving obvious traces. I remembered the long hours of exhaustive review, the dozens of photographs taken, the samples collected that seemed to lead nowhere, and how that apparent routine was interrupted by a detail that changed the course of an investigation. It was fascinating and at the same time terrifying how a body, which seemed to tell a story of peace and serenity, could silently scream such deep and painful truths. While we awaited final confirmation from the prosecutor's office to order the assistant's arrest, I took advantage of the time to review Don Ernesto's clinical files one by one, searching for any clue to complement the puzzle. I found the medical report from the last home visit, conducted only a few days earlier by the person involved. The language was technical but cold, and a particular note caught my attention: patients showing signs of extreme fatigue, although without concrete evidence of infection or acute illness. Such a vague, uncommitted adjective that it seemed more like an attempt to quickly close a visit than a real diagnosis. This small observation made me think about how many times negligence and carelessness not only hurt those they should protect, but also open spaces for abuse to flourish. I had to be patient, of course, but also firm and without losing the sensitivity that cases like this demand. Every small oversight could be another piece in the mosaic of a painful story that would be hard to reverse, but whose truth was now slowly emerging thanks to a mark that nobody wanted to see. In the following days, while the prosecutor's office worked on the evidence for the case, the pressure increased, not only because of the legal or professional consequences for the accused, but because I felt I had to maintain a connection with the memory of Don Ernesto. This was not just another file. It was a constant reminder of how oblivion and indifference can destroy lives invisible to most, but real and tangible to those of us who work in this field. In the face of that, justice could not fail. Reviewing the security footage was a fundamental step. I was able to verify the assistant's movements on dates close to the death. In one of the recordings, recovered from a device near Don Ernesto's home, he can be seen entering the house at an unusual hour, when it was already night and most neighbors were asleep. This presence seemed natural, part of his duties, but when comparing the times to the estimated moment of death, the pieces of the puzzle began to align with unsettling precision. However, what really struck me was a chronological analysis performed by a team of forensic experts on the body's data. They determined that the injury on the neck, that pressure mark, which initially seemed trivial, corresponded to a specific moment in the last hours of life, and that the toxin had been administered almost simultaneously. That fierce coordination between physical and chemical aggression demonstrated premeditation that chilled me to the bone, because it showed someone had planned every move with the intention of leaving no visible traces, leaving only the marks that only a trained eye could uncover. My mind would never have lingered so long on a simple mark if I had not understood that bodies speak in their own language. And that experience made me reflect on how little we sometimes value the small details in our environment, which can be the key to unraveling truths that risk being lost in the silence imposed by fear, guilt, or indifference. As the investigation continued, I realized this case had changed me. The feeling of fulfilling my duty mixed with a deeper, more human sentiment. The responsibility to protect those who have no voice, to be a bridge so their stories, however painful, are heard and recognized. I understood that forensic medicine goes beyond science. It is an act of justice, memory, and humanity. Every time I think about the mark I found on Don Ernesto's neck, I think of his closed eyes, the serenity of his face, and that small mark that seemed insignificant but was the loudest, clearest voice in this entire story. That mark not only changed the course of the investigation, but taught me that in our work, the truth is always in the details, in the subtle and the hidden. That justice requires patience and sharpness to see what others do not want or cannot see. I will never forget that case nor the lesson it left me. Sometimes, the small signs hold the greatest truths. And in a fast-moving world, stopping to look carefully can save lives and change destinies. The unexpected is always there, waiting for someone to dare to look it straight in the face. That mark was what changed everything. The days that followed were a constant coming and going between files, testimonies, and forensic analyses. Each new piece seemed to fit into a puzzle that revealed a much more complex network than I had initially imagined. What appeared to be a simple case of natural or accidental death transformed into a web with a shadow of abuse, manipulation, and deadly silence extended beyond the immediate. We began to scrutinize the visits of the assistant, not only to Mr. Ernesto, but also to other elderly adults under his care. Gradually, disturbing patterns emerged. Some inconsistent reports, minor complaints that were never formalized, and a series of calls to home care services that abruptly stopped without explanation. It was as if someone wanted to cover their tracks, erase any evidence that could point to growing and calculated abuse. I vividly remember the night I reviewed the photographs I took at the scene again. The office light was dim, and as I examined over and over the area around Mr. Ernesto's neck, the shadows seemed to play with me. That mark, which at first seemed almost invisible, now revealed itself as an unequivocal sign of silenced violence, a mute communication of pain and resistance. The skin showed not only physical pressure, but also a trace that seemed to point to someone who tried to control and dominate until the very last moment. But then something happened that changed the pace of the investigation. An unexpected call from a neighbor who appeared to have seen something strange on that fatal day. It was not a direct lead, but a subtle perception, an almost unnoticed detail that, when connected with the cameras and reports, started to make sense. He mentioned a noise, like a slight struggle, a barely whispered argument that kept him awake for a few minutes in the early morning. For many, it might have been nothing, but for us, it was valuable information, a window into what might really have happened. It was at that moment that our perspective broadened even more, and we began to investigate Mr. Ernesto's social and emotional environment, a man who, despite his age and fragility, had a history of dignity and resistance. We discovered letters, some old, others recent, that spoke of his fears, his distrust of certain people close to him, and a firm desire that his story would not end forgotten. In them, unknowingly, he left clues about the murky atmosphere in his home, about the shadow that haunted him from the person who was supposed to care for him. As the investigation progressed, the pressure on the assistant increased. Authorities began to question him more firmly, and although at first he tried to maintain an impassive facade, inconsistencies in his answers and the anxiety shown on his face became evident. At times, he seemed trapped in a web of his own lies, and at others fragile, like a man consumed by the weight of his actions and the fear of being discovered. The chemical evidence was decisive. Not only did it prove the presence of an uncommon toxin, but detailed analysis indicated that the substance was administered in calculated doses to cause progressive and silent harm. It was not an accident or negligence. It was a cold, deliberate act. The combination of the physical force that left that mark on the neck and the injection of the lethal substance spoke of a criminal who knew exactly what he was doing and how to evade justice at first glance. An unexpected twist occurred when, Among the documents found at the assistant's home, a list with names, dates, and codes appeared. At first, we did not know what it meant, but an expert analysis revealed it was a record of irregular payments and illicit favors. Some of the names matched people related to social services or medical entities, which opened the door to a possible network of corruption and negligence much broader. This was no longer just an isolated case of abuse, but a symptom of a system that sometimes does not protect, but allows the most vulnerable to fall into the hands of those who only seek their own benefit. Meanwhile, Mr. Ernesto's family, initially devastated and distrustful, began to find meaning in their grief through the investigation. His eldest son, who initially struggled to believe in the assistant's guilt, became a fundamental ally, providing valuable information and helping reconstruct his father's daily life in the weeks before his death. Their testimonies, filled with pain and frustration, made us understand that the body not only speaks but also screams when someone listens attentively. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, aware that behind the data, marks, and reports was a real person who had suffered in silence. I questioned my role and that of the other professionals involved because, in an ideal system, no elderly person should face those terrors in their own home. The loneliness that had been the setting for this crime was the same that made it harder to detect the danger in time, and that hit me harder and harder, reminding me that every case is also an urgent call to improve sensitivity and social care. As the prosecutor's office gathered enough evidence to build a solid accusation, protection measures for other possible victims intensified, and a hotline was opened for similar cases. The media coverage began to raise community awareness about the vulnerability of the elderly and the urgent need for vigilance and respect in the services provided to them. I felt that, despite the pain, we had an opportunity to turn something terrible into a lesson that would move people to action. When reviewing every photograph, sample, and note one last time, I recalled Mr. Ernesto's calm face. That serenity seemed to hide an internal storm, a silent cry seeking justice and recognition. And I understood that, as a forensic doctor, it is not only our duty to uncover the truth, but also to honor that silenced memory, giving it voice and body so that it will no longer be a victim of oblivion. What I learned from that mark on Mr. Ernesto's neck goes beyond the technical or professional sphere. It is a lesson about the importance of pausing, observing carefully, valuing the subtlety of signs that may seem insignificant at first glance but contain the key to unraveling painful realities others do not want to face. It is a call not to let cases become mere numbers or files, but to humanize them, to be guardians of those who cannot defend themselves. In those days, I often stayed awake, reviewing every detail, wondering how someone with so much knowledge of humanity could find in one small mark the complete truth of a story. I then understood it as an almost sacred act, to discover the hidden, to bring injustice to light, and to turn silence into speech. And although that mark was only a small trace, it was enough to challenge indifference, face the pain, and begin a path toward justice. I know not all cases end this way, and the struggle to protect the most vulnerable is constant and often silent. But that experience confirmed something fundamental to me, that attention to detail is the most powerful weapon we have, and that truth, although sometimes hidden behind shadows and appearances, always ends up emerging when someone is willing to look closely and bravely. Mr. Ernesto taught me that every life matters, that behind every body there is a story, a past, and a desire to be recognized and respected, that the marks we leave in the world can be the key to protecting others, to preventing pain from recurring, and that sometimes justice begins in the attentive gaze of someone who refuses to accept what seems obvious just because it is comfortable. As I closed that chapter, I felt a mix of sadness and hope. Sadness for the loss and suffering, but hope for the learning, the action, and the possibility of being part of the change. I knew I would continue to examine every case with the same passion, with the same sensitivity, because every mark, no matter how small, can change the fate of a person and, ultimately, of an entire community. I will never forget the mark on Mr. Ernesto's neck, nor the silent strength that mark contained. That mark reminded me that truth can lie in the most subtle details, and that sometimes to find it, it is necessary to stop, look patiently, and listen to what others do not want to hear. Because in that search lies not only justice, but also the dignity and respect we all deserve. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to progress at a relentless pace, although sometimes seemingly almost halted. Every time we thought we had closed the circle, a new element arose to open another path, making it clear that this story was not divided into simple chapters or straight lines. I remember a particularly cold morning when the laboratory delivered an additional report that left us all contemplating an even darker scenario. A chemical mixture had been detected in Mr. Ernesto's body that not only corresponded to the lethal toxin, but also to several compounds linked to controlled medications, some restricted for complex treatments. How had that gotten there? Who had access to those drugs? The answer did not take long to emerge, albeit with heavier and more disturbing weight. More suspicion circled around the assistant, yes, but what we discovered by investigating his professional and personal environment was an invisible network of complicity and neglect. Some colleagues had his back, others exchanged glances or diverted questions. The pressure on them began to grow, and with it, small cracks in their versions. That list with names and codes started taking a life of its own. They were not just payments, but contracts, favors, and in some cases, orders that matched the regular movements of resources intended for the care of elderly adults in several districts. The system, which seemed to protect vulnerability, actually served to shield opaque interests. With each new witness statement, it became clear that Mr. Ernesto was not the only one suffering under that shadow. There were other names, other bodies narrating similar silences, other gestures of fear and resistance that never came to be reported simply because the voices were silenced prematurely. It was then that I understood that the minimal mark on the elderly man's neck was only the visible tip of a dark and painful iceberg, something that exceeded a single case and demanded profound change in social perspective. Meanwhile, the assistant began to show signs of wear. During another interrogation session, I saw him stagger, not only from judicial pressure, but from the evident internal struggle between denying the truth and the fear of succumbing to the weight of his own actions. At one point, he almost whispered confession that didn't last even a minute before retracting it, as if part of him wanted to release that pain while another dragged him into a pit of absolute denial. He was a man trapped in a self-imposed tangle, with the same desperation as someone who knows the truth is about to catch him. A detail that seemed minor at first, a message on the assistant's cell phone, turned into a cornerstone. The conversation contained a veiled threat directed at an alleged uncomfortable witness, and although no one knew exactly who it referred to, the message was clear. There was a lot of fear, a lot of power hidden behind that facade of caregivers. The prosecutor's office decided to act quickly, implementing protection measures for whoever that person was, and we prepared for the next chapter of this seemingly endless investigation. Sensitivity began to manifest in every corner. Not only us, the forensic experts, but also the investigators, lawyers, and above all, Mr. Ernesto's family, who felt that justice was no longer a distant abstraction, but a tangible reality that could change their lives and those of many others. The eldest son, who initially had doubts, now appeared firm, determined to cooperate until the end. A man whose voice trembled not with fear, but with an intense mix of grief and hope, redefining for me the true meaning of this work. Not just seeking evidence, but accompanying that human process born from pain and resilience. As we progressed, there was a key moment I still vividly remember. We worked with digital analysis experts to untangle the security cameras of the house. For days, we carefully reviewed every image, looking not only for movements but gestures, glances, details, and expressions that could tell more than words. In the end, we identified a silhouette that night shouldn't have been there. Someone who entered and left with nervous steps, perhaps aware that what they were doing was marked by injustice and impunity. That figure became the missing piece to connect the abuse with the lethal injection, and also with the irregular behavioral patterns we had detected in the assistant. I felt that each advance exposed a much darker and broader reality, a wound involving not only people but structures, systems that in theory should protect. The most painful thing was to acknowledge how, in the invisible everyday, fear and violence could camouflage so well that they became routine silence, routine negligence disguised as care. I understood that to break that chain, the mark found on Mr. Ernesto was a call not to settle for simple explanations or superficial solutions, but to look with more attentive eyes and an open heart toward the most vulnerable. Tensions in the team also grew. Amid meetings, reports, and analyses, debates were heard about how far our responsibility extended beyond the strictly scientific field. Should we become social whistleblowers? Was it possible to be impartial and also activists? Personally, I face these dilemmas because the truth we were uncovering demanded more than technical silence. It required action commitment. And, in a way, that mark on Mr. Ernesto's neck, small and barely noticeable, served as a symbol of a much greater struggle that crossed professional and moral boundaries. While the prosecutor's office prepared the formal accusation, the community began to mobilize. Human rights organizations, support groups for elderly people, and the press started to focus on similar cases and the demand for structural changes. It seemed that, against all odds, Mr. Ernesto's voice had managed to break the wall of silence that so often protects the guilty. In informal conversations with some community leaders, I heard that this story was helping open spaces where, before there were taboos, where shame and fear silenced those who most needed to be heard and cared for. Finally, there was a morning when I could calmly review the crime scene again, accompanied by a detail-oriented photographer. The precision with which that small trace on the neck had been recorded took on new meaning. It was not only evidence, but a firm voice reaching far beyond that night. I wanted to imagine Mr. Ernesto in his last moments, and through that mark, I somehow felt his resistance, his silent struggle to be recognized, to be cared for with dignity. The feeling of helplessness coexisted with a strange peace, because we knew that Mark could no longer be ignored or hidden. However, the story was not over. With each new piece of information, each testimony, a path opened toward new questions, toward the pursuit of justice not only for Mr. Ernesto, but for all who might be living in similar conditions. I learned that truth is a dynamic process, a constant construction in which no one is exempt from involvement, that traces, although minimal and pernicious, can be beams of light capable of piercing the darkness of oblivion and neglect. In that process, I also understood the importance of active listening, not only analyzing bodies and evidence, but capturing the whispers behind words, the emotions contained in silence, the story that only someone attentive can discover. And although the mark had been the first physical sign, that openness to see with empathy and depth was what allowed us to unravel a complex plot of pain, abuse, and abandonment. To this day, when I think of that mark, I am overwhelmed by a mixture of great respect and responsibility, because I know that within that small detail lay a great truth, an uncomfortable truth that few were willing to face, but that imposed itself with the strength of one who does not want to be forgotten or silenced. A truth that reminded me that being a forensic specialist is not just measuring damage or recording evidence, but being the guardian of stories of life and death, of dignities that deserve to be preserved. I know this experience changed my understanding of my profession and my role in society. It taught me to pause, to look carefully, not to underestimate any detail, because sometimes the deepest secret is hidden in what seems insignificant. And if one learns to be patient, to listen, then one can become a bridge between silence and justice, between the victim and recognition. I will never forget the mark on Mr. Ernesto's neck, that tiny mark, invisible to hurried eyes, but containing a whole story of resistance and truth. That mark allowed me not only to change the course of an investigation, but to witness the power that small signs have to transform realities. And that lesson is what I want to share, because I know that in the daily work of those of us who safeguard the truth, every detail can be a window to a better world, to a future where respect and dignity are inviolable for all. That is why, when I close this chapter, I do so with the certainty that, although justice often feels distant and slow, commitment, attention, and perseverance have the power to break through indifference and bring to light what silence wanted to hide. And in that search, traces become guides, truth the goal, and memory respect, because in the end, in every body lies a story that deserves to be heard. What came afterward was, without a doubt, one of the most complex and revealing moments of my career. Months of investigation, now fraught with uncertainties and silent confrontations, led me to understand that the small mark on Don Ernesto's neck was just one of many broken fragments of a much more painful and hidden truth. As we progressed, the tension grew not only among those of us in charge of the case, but also within the system itself that, in theory, was supposed to protect the most vulnerable. That perceptible crack revealed to me more clearly how corruption, fear, and indifference could intertwine within the most sacred institutions. I clearly remember the day when a forensic technology team made an unexpected breakthrough. Among piles of data, images, and phone records, a repeated contact appeared, a voice that seemed to show up in places and at times where it shouldn't. This person, who until then had been hidden behind multiple layers of anonymity, was a key piece in a network of negligence and abuse we were uncovering. The connection with the assistant, once routine and seemingly simple, now revealed multiple facets of cover-up and forced collaboration. When confronting this evidence during one of the proceedings, the atmosphere became charged with indescribable tension. In the room, there were evasive glances, short whispers, trembling hands. In those moments, the feeling of facing an uncomfortable but relentless truth became palpable. It was one of those scenes where time seems to slow down, where every word weighs heavily and every silence screams. The assistant, who had previously appeared so firm in his denials, began to crumble under the pressure of the irrefutable. What he managed to confess, though fragmented and initially unbelievable to some, opened perspective that no one expected. There was not only personal responsibility, but a structured complicity involving those who, in theory, should have cared for the well-being of people like Don Ernesto. Behind that apparent routine and care hid dark interests, tacit agreements, and considerable criminal neglect. What we were living through was like watching a giant chessboard, where every move piece triggered unforeseen reactions. That mark, which had seemed so insignificant at first, began to take the shape of evidence that cut off escape routes for those who had tried to silence the truth. The investigation was not only exposing specific acts of malpractice, but an entire culture that had normalized abuse, fear, and cover-up. Each new piece of data brought with it a domino effect, unleashing deep cracks in a system that, until that moment, had operated under the banner of unquestioned protection. When the prosecution team decided to expand the investigation, the pressures became more evident. Unwanted presences appeared in the lives of some witnesses. Others began receiving calls with veiled threats, and fear started to infiltrate spaces that previously seemed impenetrable. It was an exhausting process for everyone. For Don Ernesto's family who wanted justice, for the work team bearing the responsibility of unmasking this network, and for me, who, through a medicine accustomed to measuring damage, now face a reality where human and social consequences touch me deeply and directly. A particularly difficult moment was when I had to face Don Ernesto's family and explain what we were uncovering without losing hope or empathy. The look from his eldest son, despite the obvious pain, spoke to me far more than any word could. It was then that I understood this case went beyond the limits of forensic medicine, making us responsible not only for documenting facts, but also for accompanying a process of healing and collective struggle. The story of that elderly man had become a silent but powerful symbol reverberating in those who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, what security cameras and digital analyses showed us revealed disturbing patterns. The silhouette we had identified at the house that night was not acting alone. Record began to appear of repeated visits, entries and exits at unusual hours, emails with ambiguous instructions, and orders that seemed to come from higher, more distant levels. It was as if a hidden, complex, and well-oiled machine was operating behind the scenes to maintain a scheme that kept vulnerable people in a perpetual state of risk and neglect. The more we unearthed, the clearer it became that Don Ernesto's case was neither an exception nor a coincidence. It was a visible face of a systemic problem demanding urgent attention and structural changes. The nights of work became endless, reviewing reports, analyzing fragmented confessions, coordinated with authorities, and above all, sustaining ethics and hope was a true challenge. At those moments, what struck me most was that behind every number, every piece of scientific evidence, and every statement, there were lives cut short, extinguished dreams, and torn apart families. But there was also an opportunity, a chance for reconstruction, an invitation not to let the story fall into oblivion or be silently repeated. One scene I still cannot erase was when, during an inspection at a healthcare facility in the same municipality, we found conditions bordering on criminal negligence. Deteriorated spaces, irregular documentation, and testimonies from employees who, fearful, raised their voices in fragile whispers about what they saw daily. It was an instant when justice could no longer be an abstract concept, but an urgent and collective demand. I then understood that my role as a forensic specialist, far from being limited to the crime scene, had to be broadened. We have the ethical responsibility to be active agents in making those hidden pains visible, to be the voice for those who cannot speak. However, amid all that tense broth of suspicions and denunciations, the most genuine humanity and unexpected solidarity also appeared. Some people who initially held peripheral roles in this story began to show courage. A worker at the facility who risked his job to provide vital information, a neighbor who had seen strange movements, and the family of another elderly person who added their testimony. Those small acts, almost invisible from the outside, were the silent force that sustained the weight of a truth which otherwise would have remained buried. For weeks, I spent long hours reviewing every detail, questioning every version, and connecting the dots between chemical evidence, statements, and patterns. The emotional burden was great, but even greater was a commitment to justice and truth. One night, after a particularly tough meeting with the prosecutor's office, I knew we were ready to move to the next phase, to present the evidence decisively, initiate formal legal actions against those involved, and perhaps most importantly, give voice and name to what Don Ernesto and many others could not say in life. When that day came, a kind of strange calm enveloped me, knowing that the mark that had taken me on this journey had ceased to be a mere technical detail. To become a symbol of resistance and struggle was a deeply moving moment. The courtroom was not just a legal setting, but a scene where recognition of a fundamental right was woven, the right to be cared for with respect and dignity. And although justice may seem like a slow and tangled path, that day I glimpsed that at its foundation lies an unstoppable force, the persistence of truth accompanied by the courage of those who refuse to give up. Back in my office, I reviewed once again the image of that mark on Don Ernesto's neck, and I felt it was not simply a physical trace, but a living testimony. That small detail we dismissed as irrelevant was, in reality, the key that opened a door to justice and beyond that, to hope. This case changed my perspective, my work, and the commitment I have with myself and with those who trust that the truth can be uncovered, no matter how small the sign guiding us. Because I learned in the hardest way that even the smallest mark has the power to change everything. What came next was a mix of physical exhaustion and an emotional burden that felt like a weight growing heavier and harder to bear each day. It wasn't just an eagerness to uncover the truth, but the growing feeling that this truth could change not only a specific case, but challenge an entire system that until then had seemed invulnerable. During endless nights of review, I went through the reports from start to finish, trying not to leave a single detail unanalyzed, hoping to find a connection that would accelerate things, but also with a constant fear that someone might slip through, that due to an error or omission, everything would collapse. Every breakthrough seemed to open a new door, one that revealed an even more complex and dark reality. When we began to analyze phone records in greater depth, something caught my attention. There were communication patterns between certain residential employees and outside individuals that seemed to coordinate almost clandestinely visits and movements. I tried to understand why someone would want to keep those contacts secret, what interest there was in protecting those meetings, and above all, what that implied for people like Don Ernesto. It was as if, beneath it all, there was a parallel network, a sort of hidden enterprise within the care system itself operating under strict codes and imposed silences. That idea started to haunt me persistently, and its mere presence changed the way I saw many of those involved. I could no longer blindly trust what they told me or the expressions on their faces. Tensions within the team also became more evident at that time. Some colleagues showed clear signs of being affected by the emotional weight and external pressure we were under. It wasn't just a workload. It was a fear of retaliation, the uncertainty about how far those wanting to protect their secrets would go. Often, the silences and furtive glances in meetings were as telling as their words, and I understood that everyone dealt with the ethical and professional conflict differently. In some cases, I even felt there were internal divisions. Part of the team wanted to push forward as strongly as possible, while another saw extreme caution, trying not to touch certain points to avoid greater harm. That contradiction increased the tension and forced me to take a clear stance, reaffirming my own conviction that the truth, no matter how painful, needed to come to light. What I did not expect was a reaction of some high-ranking officials within the institution overseeing those residences. At first, we presented the irregularities with facts, documents, and testimony that left no room for doubt. However, what followed was a calculated attempt to minimize and relativize everything, as if Don Ernesto's case were isolated and insignificant. We received official statements carefully designed to appear concerned, but without any concrete action. I then felt a brutal clash with the administrative reality, where words seemed just that, empty words meant to silence public noise while the old systems remained intact. That double face hurt me personally. We had spent months gathering evidence, witnesses, expert reports, and we faced a wall of bureaucratic indifference that sought to protect interests, not people. However, not all was discouragement. A surprising turn happened when an unexpected person, a mid-level official who until then seemed just another cog in the system, decided to step forward. It was a brave and surprising act, especially considering the atmosphere of fear and threats that dominated the investigation. This person handed us internal documents with detailed records of expenses, schedules, and calls confirming the suspicions we had already developed. There was a chain of complicity stretching from frontline employees to figures with real power within the organizations. That disclosure not only strengthened our investigation, but gave us renewed momentum, a light in the darkness that empowered us to continue despite threats and obstacles. It was especially difficult to process. In those days, the contradiction between what part of the system was hiding and humanity that also emerged among those who suffered in silence. I met employees who, despite the context, refused to remain silent, who sought to protect the elderly as much as they could, paying a very high price simply for doing what was right in a hostile environment. I also found families who, thanks to this investigation, began to feel that justice could reach them, that their pain was not invisible nor their sacrifice forgotten. That reminded me why I had chosen this profession, why every examination, every report, every testimony made sense when it could change lives. The pressure soon translated into direct consequences. Some key witnesses withdrew their statements out of fear. There were clear threats, anonymous calls, and even false accusations seemingly designed to discredit the process and those carrying it out. The sense of vulnerability hit us all, but also reinforced the idea that we were on the right path. Truth always makes uncomfortable those who prefer everything to remain hidden. I learned to live with that kind of tension, to move forward without losing sight of the goal, not only as professional duty, but as an ethical commitment to justice, and to Don Ernesto, whose small trace had unleashed everything. As we proceeded, new elements emerged that further complicated the plot. We discovered, for example, that some residences linked to the case not only had precarious conditions, but were also part of circuits trafficking medications and resources diverted for benefit of certain individuals. That explained many of the visible deficiencies in care, and also opened an economic dimension to the problem that no official document acknowledged. It was like opening Pandora's box, where each discovery led to another, and what seemed a local, isolated case grew into a broader network involving multiple actors and, in a way, reflecting deep structural failures in our health and social protection system. It was hard to maintain the balance between forensic objectivity and the emotional burden that all this accumulation of sinister facts generated. I remember whole nights watching security camera footage, try to identify details others might have missed passing quickly, searching for even smaller signals to help us piece together that puzzle. Nights when fatigue made me doubt, but when the commitment to truth and the memory of Don Ernesto pushed me forward. At those times, I also understood the importance of working with a united, sensitive, professional, and above all, human team, because that combination was one of our best weapons against those who wanted this forgotten in the dark. One of the moments that marked me the most was when we managed, with the help of forensic technology experts, to reconstruct the exact sequence of Don Ernesto's last hours. It was not just a technical exercise, but a way to return voice and dignity to him, to show that despite everything, his life mattered and would not be reduced to a mere statistic or forgotten file. That reconstruction also exposed glaring errors in care protocols, negligence that could not go unnoticed or be justified under any argument. The sum of that evidence was a real slap in the face to the idea that we had only been unlucky or faced isolated incidents. It was a clear and painful pattern of systematic abandonment. As we advanced in presenting all this evidence, I realized that Don Ernesto's case was becoming a reference point for a much broader social demand. Conversations outside the courtroom Comments in the media and reactions from various sectors, even beyond health, showed that we were touching a sensitive nerve, a wound many prefer to ignore, but that now began to demand attention. That public recognition added a new dimension to our work, because it was no longer just a particular case, but being an active part of a bigger struggle, being voices for those who had none, and paving a way for changes that should never have been postponed. In the following weeks, as hearings began and testimonies were presented one by one, the room filled with contained emotions, moment of tension, and sincere lapses of relief. Hearing people who dare to tell their truth after so long reminded me that justice is not just a cold, legal process. It is human, fragile, and sometimes slow, but also deeply transformative when sustained with conviction. In those sessions, the mark I had discovered on Don Ernesto's neck ceased to be a simple forensic clue, to become a symbol of resistance, memory, and hope. Returning to read that small trace in my notes, I felt again like the forensic doctor who at first saw just another case, but could no longer look the same way. I had understood that in my work lies a great power, to make invisible stories visible, to fight indifference and injustice, to give voice to those who cannot speak. That trace, insignificant to many, changed not only the course of an investigation, but also my way of understanding my role in the world. Because, ultimately, I realize that truth carries those small marks that may go unnoticed, but have the strength to open paths where there seem to be only walls. Even today, when I think of Don Ernesto and all that trace unleashed, I feel a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for all the pain I came to know behind it, but hope because I know that story did not end with him, but opened a door for others to be protected, respected, and heard. I firmly believe my duty does not end here, that this responsibility must be shared, and that as a society, we must learn that even the smallest sign can be the spark that transforms darkness into light. And as long as there are traces to find and truths to tell, my commitment will remain intact, because justice, although it sometimes seems slow and invisible, is a living force that does not stop as the investigation progressed. The pressure intensified, and each day brought new revelations that, instead of simplifying matters, seemed to entangle the web even more. There was one particular moment I remember clearly. That early morning when I received an anonymous call, with a barely whispered voice, full of urgency and fear. They warned me that certain documents we had managed to obtain, those pointing to financial irregularities and chains of complicity, were about to disappear. That warning not only kept me awake at night, but also confirmed what we had already suspected. We were touching the most sensitive nerves of the system, doing everything possible to remain hidden, intact, untouchable. In those minutes, sitting in the darkness of my makeshift office in front of the screen, I realized that our work not only determined the course of that case, but also represented a real danger to those inhabiting the shadows of the system. We immediately began to safeguard our evidence, digitizing, copying, and dispersing that information among trusted allies who also felt the weight of responsibility. It was a race against time, where small mistakes could mean returning to square one or losing all progress made. The tension was palpable in the air, and at the same time, it was a clear sign that we had hurt those unwilling to be exposed. For the first time, I felt that our role went beyond forensic science. We were active participants in a silent battle against corruption and systemic abuse that caused so much harm to the most vulnerable. But the resistance did not only come from executive offices or high-ranking officials. There were also moments of unexpected betrayal within our own team. Some colleagues, given into pressure or simply fearful, began to show signs of withdrawal. The dynamic changed. Meetings became tenser, and the feeling that someone was not fully committed to the truth became increasingly concrete. At first, I resisted accepting that possibility, but experience taught me not to underestimate how fear can change people and how, even in the best environments, cracks can exist that threaten to crumble everything. However, instead of being completely disconcerted, this pushed me to redouble efforts to maintain unity and strengthen trust among those truly willing to move forward regardless of the consequences. Amid that climate, we decided to apply a renewed strategy, not only documenting and collecting evidence, but also begin to listen more to those who had previously been ignored or silenced. The families of residents, lower-ranking employees, and even some healthcare professionals with intact ethics found in us a channel to share what they lived through and suffered. Those accounts, sometimes heartbreaking, gave a human face to the numbers and statistics that until then seemed cold and distant. It was also an awakening for me, reminding me once again that forensic medicine is not just about detecting causes of death or injuries, but understanding how those situations affect entire lives in multiple contexts. Every story, every held-back tear testified to the real value of fighting institutional indifference. A twist I never saw coming was when, amid all the tension, one of the residents from one of the implicated homes did something unexpected. They managed to communicate with us through a letter hidden among the documents we were reviewing. It was a text full of honesty and courage, a voice emanating from the imposed silence, and the vulnerability of someone who knew that their life depended on justice being done. In that message, the resident spoke of abuse, lack of care, but also of small acts of everyday resistance, those gestures that break resignation and keep a thread of hope alive. That letter strengthened us emotionally, reminded us that we were facing a case with multiple dimensions, and, above all, that we were not just neutral observers but active participants in a struggle for dignity and respect. As these elements accumulated, the network that once seemed invisible began to become undeniably visible. We uncovered a web of connections between those homes, supplier companies, and certain political offices, where corruption and mismanagement of resources were common currency. The pattern repeated again and again. Economic diversions, irregular contracts, and complicit silences that could only be maintained thanks to the absence of effective controls and internal complicities. It was a painful epiphany. We understood that by investigating a single case, we were actually uncovering the deep flaws of a system that not only failed to care, but was designing mechanisms to perpetuate neglect and injustice. The most distressing part was realizing that this system of silence and cover-ups, sustained by fear and corruption, formed a vicious circle difficult to break. For every complaint, for every progress we made, new obstacles and resistance appeared to slow down the truth. And yet, small victories also emerged, growing support from civil society, awareness raised through conscientious media, and a renewed commitment of those within the system who still believed in genuine care. These victories, though modest, had a bright effect, nourished our spirits, and allowed us to keep going, because we knew our work revolved around a crucial point, transforming the structures so that tragedies like Don Ernesto's would never happen again. One of the hardest chapters of the stage was when, during a key hearing, one of the accused tried to manipulate the judicial process with false testimonies and planted evidence. The boldness was such that it forced us to be even more meticulous with every detail, scrutinizing every document and statement. The tension was palpable, almost unbearable, because these maneuvers put not only the investigation at risk, but also the trust of the families and the community watching us with hope. The team closed ranks around the fight for truth, and thanks to the collaboration of experts in document analysis and forensic technology, we were able to dismantle those attempts and expose the manipulation strategies. It was a cruel but necessary reminder. The truth faced active opposition, but also had unexpected allies and powerful tools to remain steadfast. During those days, I experienced indescribable personal growth. The crisis forced us to redefine not only tactics, but also our professional and human ethics. I realized that being a forensic doctor is much more than confirming scientific facts. It is being a voice for the voiceless, a guardian who must balance technical accuracy with empathy. It was not easy to bear the weight of each case, nor detach myself from profound pain of families awaiting justice. But I also learned that our convictions can be a light in the darkness, and that truth, although delayed, is unstoppable when built on solid facts and an unwavering commitment. There was an episode etched in my memory. One winter day, while reviewing a forgotten records room, we found a worn notebook with notes that seemed like poems written by a resident who was no longer there. Those words, so simple and full of nostalgia, spoke of broken dreams, hopes, and also that subtle plea to be seen and heard. Reading those lines was a deeply moving experience because it reminded us that behind the rigidity of reports and evidence there were lives with stories, emotions, and dignity worthy of respect. That emotional connection, though subtle, was a turning point for all of us working on the case. It consolidated us as a team not only technical, but human. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, but we did not let our guard down. Every testimony, every analysis, Every hour spent understanding the dark circuits and system failures brought us closer to unmasking a truth that at first seemed almost invisible. However, it also showed us that this truth had many layers, and that justice is not a straight line but a tortuous path where patience and conviction are as necessary as courage and technique. For me, the mark found on Don Ernesto's neck became a symbol not only of the search, but of resistance against indifference and cover-ups. I remember one of the last meetings before the final presentation of our investigation was especially symbolic. We sat down, almost exhausted, surrounded by computers, documents, and photographs, and felt a deep respect for what we had achieved together. At that moment, beyond the fatigue, a certainty emerged. We had contributed to something bigger, a change that had already begun to take root. We did not know what would happen next or what resistances would continue to rise, but we were aware that, no matter what, Don Ernesto and every affected person would not be forgotten. That was our silent promise, and also the driving force, keeping our motivation alive to continue. Just as I felt overwhelmed by the complexity and harshness of the process, I also felt profound gratitude for having been part of this story that, although painful, transcended a clinical case to become a national wake-up call. I understood that the true scope of my work goes far beyond autopsies and reports. It is a vital commitment to social justice, to protecting the most vulnerable, and to firmly defending the values that make a more humane and just society possible. That discovered mark was a spark that lit a light, one that still shines and that I need to feed daily with every action, every word, and every revealed truth. I still keep the photo of that mark, that small trace that seemed insignificant, yet is the most powerful evidence that truth exists in the smallest details, in those little signs few see but which, when illuminated, forever change how we understand the world. I do not know what other cases will come, nor how many times I will feel again that mix of emotion and responsibility only this work can provoke. What I do know is that as long as there are marks to discover, I will be here, in the constant search, so that those hidden truths do not die with those who cannot defend themselves, but emerge as beacons of justice for all. Because in the end, the true strength of justice is not in scribbled words or cold laws, but in those stories, in those tiny marks left by people going through pain and injustice. And it is in them where the hope to transform what seemed impossible resides. When I look back at that mark that changed everything, I know it was not just forensic evidence, but call to awaken, to act, and not to allow indifference to continue governing what should be sacred. Care, dignity, and respect for human life. That lesson accompanies me every day, and I know without a doubt that none of this is over. It has only just begun. That period following the revelation of the mark on Don Ernesto's neck became a whirlwind I had never imagined having to deal with. Each day was a two-front battle. On one hand, the technical complexity of the investigation demanded absolute rigor to leave no loose ends. On the other, the emotional and social pressure, the latent threat, and the need to protect what had been discovered kept everyone in an almost permanent state of alert. I remember those long nights when the city seemed to sleep, but we kept working, illuminated only by the cold light of the monitors and the faint desk lamp. It was a heavy silence, but deep down we felt driven by something greater than mere professional routine. One of the things that struck me most was how figures who had until then remained in the shadows began to emerge, from subordinate employees to small local authorities who, fearful yet determined, wanted to break the omerta surrounding those residences. Their testimonies, though not always complete or clear, were vital pieces that allowed us to outline a more complete map of systematic negligence and abuse. The mixture of fear and hope of which they spoke to us was deeply moving. These were voices insisting on being heard, on truth, on justice, playing a decisive role that contrasted with the bureaucratic coldness we had encountered at the start. But as we closed those seemingly invisible networks, new obstacles multiplied. It was during one of those heavy days that we realized someone had managed to infiltrate our information channels. Documents were altered, emails intercepted, and there were even subtle attempts to discredit the work of some key team members with rumors that sought to sow doubt rather than provide evidence. It was clear that those who felt threatened would not give up without a fierce fight, and the shadow of espionage and betrayal began to fall upon us like never before. That feeling of vulnerability was paralyzing, but also forced us to be more astute, to rethink every move, to not give up any piece easily. In the midst of this critical juncture, an unexpected figure appeared to change the rules of the game. one of the most veteran investigators, a man who until then had worked behind the scenes, approached me with decisive information he had kept for months. His data revealed the existence of a direct link between some of the residents' contracts and opaque financial movements crossing borders. The incredible thing was that these transfers not only corroborated corruption allegations, but also opened a door to possible major economic crimes that complicated the situation even further. I remember that day, receiving that report. A mixture of disbelief and hope overwhelmed me. We were facing a much deeper web than anything I had imagined. I then decided it was urgent to seek collaborations beyond the usual circle. We contacted experts in forensic finance, independent auditors, even investigative journalists with a recognized trajectory and ethics. The first meetings were a blend of caution and enthusiasm because we knew this alliance could be key to sustaining the fight, but also increase risk. However, the will to seek justice in the sense of opening an essential door for real change gradually formed a solid network of committed allies. It was a stage where I felt the community, beyond the medical and judicial fields, was beginning to awaken to something that had been invisible for too long. While those strategic meetings progressed, the case continued growing on the operational ground. There was an episode that marked us particularly, a clandestine meeting in a central cafe where a former employee of one of the residences agreed, nervously and on condition of keeping his identity secret, to speak. What he told us was chilling. He recounted systematic practices of hiding serious incidents, direct orders so certain cases would never be officially recorded, and a complex system of silence keeping internal whistleblowers at bay. The most striking part was when he described the existence of a select group managing, from the shadows, the reputation in business, manipulating figures and testimonies to protect economic interests. That revelation turned what seemed an isolated case into a true conspiracy of neglect and corruption. I felt that as we unraveled the plot, each new layer led us into darker, but also more important territory. That is why, despite the fatigue and uncertainty, we could not afford to let our guard down. Ethics and dedication became our beacons, the compass in front of the system designed to blind us with threats and distractions. Internal cooperation remained a challenge, especially after some loyalties were shown to be fragile, but fortunately, the core team rose, strengthening under the heavy burden with admirable determination. Every meeting, every joint analysis, was an act of resistance in itself. The accumulation of evidence, however, demanded a presentation prepared with the precision of a surgeon, not simply gathering documents, but telling an indisputable story that dismantled lies and clearly explained the magnitude of what had happened. In this process, Don Ernesto's figure remained present, not only as a victim, but as a symbol of all those who have been ignored and mistreated. It was a challenge to keep the narrative balance between scientific rigor and human dimension, that empathy reminding us why we were fighting. Thus, days and nights passed as we refined reports, created infographics, listened to families, and crafted a discourse appealing to social and judicial conscience. As the case began to gain public traction, reactions from power began as well. Some media sought sensationalism, others tried to minimize the impact, while certain political figures attempted to divert attention with criticisms, personal attacks, and mutual denunciations. It was then that I understood the fight for truth would not only unfold in courts or forensic investigations, but also in the public arena, in the battle for opinion and collective memory. The truth of society began to look with new eyes at the problem of elder care homes, and although this created tension, it also opened a space for discussion that had been denied until then. I remember that amid that turmoil, a small yet significant episode brought relief. A group of volunteers and activists inspired by our work decided to organize a march demanding dignity and transparency in the care system. The initial turnout was modest, but the strength of that symbolic act transcended and sparked a chain reaction in different parts of the country. Seeing those people raising their voices with banners and clear messages reaffirmed to me that we were contributing to something bigger, that not only deaths tell stories, but life also imposes a need to act and change. As the crucial date for the final presentation of the investigation approached, tension in the air was like contained electricity. We had learned to protect ourselves, but uncertain about how those feeling threatened would react was always present. During those days, anonymous calls and coded messages increased, creating an atmosphere where the line between paranoia and reality blurred. But also then, more than ever, I had to keep my gaze firmly fixed on the goal: justice. Because our responsibility was not only to make visible that mark on Don Ernesto's neck, but to make visible everything that mark represented. Humanity destroyed, lack of integrity, and the still possible chance to change it. Finally, the day came when we presented the case before the relevant authorities, with all the evidence, testimonies, and analyses developed with the utmost rigor. The room was full of expectation and tension, and from the first minute, I knew there was no room for mistakes. The defense was swift, new attempt at manipulation and discrediting, technical objections, tricky questions. But our presentation was shielded, not only by the scientific work, but by the ethical commitment of those of us who had witnessed that invisible struggle. The stories and data intertwined to create an irrefutable narrative, leaving no room for doubt. When we finished, a strange sensation overcame me. It was not complete relief nor definitive victory, but rather the realization that we had just opened a door of no return. In the silence that followed, I felt that small mark found on a forgotten body had triggered an unstoppable movement. It was as if that mark, tiny but forceful, had put an entire system in check and invited us to keep walking a path that would always be challenging but necessary. I looked at my colleagues, and their eyes saw the mixture of fatigue, hope, and determination we shared. Since then, nothing has stopped. The initial investigation has turned into a drive for reforms, citizen oversight, and profound re-examination of elder care across the country. As for me, I keep reviewing each case with conviction that, although the truth may be hidden in the tiniest details, it has the power to change realities. That mark, still etched in my memory in the photo I keep, reminds me that our work goes far beyond science. It is an act of justice, humanity, and resistance. And although the road ahead is uncertain, and I know new shadows will emerge trying to silence us, I also know that while there is a single mark to discover, while there is a story untold, my commitment will be to never stop seeking, never stop listening. Because the truth, even if delayed, ends up emerging, and within it lies a fire that can transform entire societies. That is the force that guides me and that I wish to share with you, friend. So we never forget that in every small detail, in every voice that seems silenced, there's a world waiting to be revealed. The mark that changed everything was not just a forensic finding. It was a powerful call to awaken, not to allow injustice to find refuge in indifference. And I carry that lesson with me every day, in every step I take as a doctor, as a person, as someone who never gives up on the truth. After that presentation before the authorities, the atmosphere did not calm down. On the contrary, the contained energy gradually transformed into something even more tangible. It was not just a matter of documents delivered or testimonies heard, but of a movement beginning to consolidate, gaining voices and faces. I felt we were treading new ground, a space where truth was not only sought with magnifying glass, but claimed with popular force. But this new phase also brought with it a series of consequences we had not fully anticipated. On one hand, the pressure increased and was no longer only on us as an investigation team, but also on the victims' families, on those who had decided to break the silence, on the witnesses who dared to tell what they knew. The shadow of fear remained long. There were veiled threats, messages in the early hours, unexpected visits to homes. But, surprisingly, a collective feeling of solidarity and mutual protection also emerged. Suddenly, that small circle of investigators began to feel part of something much bigger and more complex than a simple forensic case. It became a social heartbeat with profound repercussions, a challenge that crossed academic and professional boundaries to touch the very core of human dignity. In one of the key meetings, I remember seeing one of my colleagues, so used to handling corpses and autopsies, transform into a passionate human rights defender he had never imagined being. It was as if the weight of what we had discovered had fundamentally changed all our perceptions of our mission. It was no longer enough to expose technical truth. That finding had to be accompanied by commitment, active empathy, and a conviction of being part of an ongoing struggle. That afternoon, embroidered by the dim light filtering through the Institute's high windows, I felt we were crossing an inevitable threshold toward a phase where science and humanity had to walk together, with no exceptions. But the battle was still far from over. As the investigation became public, patterns of resistance grew more sophisticated. It was no longer just a classic imposed silence or data manipulation, but a play of mirrors and shadows aiming to fragment the narrative we had built. Disinformation campaigns were launched, contradictory versions spread, and in some cases, the very legal mechanisms were instrumentalized against us, seeking to paralyze the process's progress with endless bureaucratic hurdles and technical arguments that we knew were merely strategies to buy time. The growing tension was felt in every phone call and every email received. I especially remember an incident that made me understand the real magnitude of the danger we faced. One early morning, while reviewing some documents in my office, I received an anonymous message that included a photograph of my family. It was a brutal moment, one of those times when instinct freezes you, and the mind tries to bring order to the inner chaos. However, far from intimidating me, that message reinforced my conviction that we were touching sensitive nerves, that the truth we sought not only disturbed but threatened structures that prefer to keep everything under the rug. It was a turning point. From that moment on, personal and collective security became a priority, but never at the cost of abandoning the mission. Meanwhile, new allies began to emerge in unexpected places. Professionals from different disciplines approached us eager to contribute. Pro bono lawyers, psychologists, social workers, even politicians committed to transparency. Multidisciplinary working groups were formed that enriched the approach and lightened the burden of those of us in forensics, who had been absorbed by technicalities and emotional tension. It was a collective construction that struggled to overcome grudges, mistrust, and deep wounds, but which gained strength precisely because of its diversity and shared commitment. The initial feeling of isolation gradually gave way to a genuine movement, but the true test came when the oral trial was scheduled. We knew that much more than criminal responsibility for a few was at stake. It would determine whether the system accepted confronting its failures or closed again like a hermetic circle. The days leading up to it were marked by a mix of nervousness, obsessive preparation, and solidarity among everyone. There were endless sessions where we reviewed every detail, anticipated questions and defense tactics, and strengthened emotional resilience. And although deep down we remained aware that human justice is imperfect, we felt that trial would be a mirror reflecting change or the perpetuation of the status quo. The trial itself was a harrowing and revealing experience. The victims and their families were present, often with tears and the unwavering strength of those who knew this was their last chance to make years of suffering visible. The demand for justice rose in every word, every memory, every scientific piece of evidence presented. But as we anticipated, the defenses tried to sow doubt, minimize negligence, and divert attention with theatrics aimed at protecting interests and hiding responsibilities. It was a tough fight in the legal arena, and more than once I felt the balance hung by a thread. However, the meticulous preparation and the solid body of evidence ultimately strengthened our position. One thing was clear to everyone. This was not just a victory over those who neglected and abused the elderly, but a triumph for those who still could not raise their voices, for a culture that refused to continue accepting indifference as a norm. The sentence had a wide impact. It not only established convictions and sanctions, but triggered reform processes in the system. Documents, regulations, and protocols that seemed immovable began to be urgently and transparently reviewed. Spaces for citizen participation were opened, and the role of independent oversight was strengthened. None of this would have been possible without that insistence on not letting go of the mark on Don Ernesto's neck. Now, as I look back on everything we've gone through, I feel that discovery was a catalyst for a social awakening no one had foreseen. It showed us that in every body, in every slightest sign, there are stories that can change realities, and that science must not only seek answers, but serve as a tool for justice and social transformation. Nothing was easy. The path was full of obstacles, threats, and sacrifices, but also of unexpected encounters, genuine solidarity, and moments of profound humanity. I learned that the smallest mark can trigger an ethical earthquake, and that our responsibility transcends the laboratory or the morgue. I hold on to the idea that the struggle never ends, that shadows will always try to reappear, and the truth is a beacon that must be kept burning with constant effort. That mark, which at first was just a mark on the neck of an ordinary man, today represents a banner, a symbol of resistance and hope. And though we will never know how many similar stories were buried before justice emerged, I am convinced that as long as we remain attentive, as long as we are willing to listen to the whispers that emanate from bodies truth will continue to emerge, relentless, luminous, and transformative. That is why, my friend, I invite you to never lose that flame, to always remember that in every apparently insignificant detail, a silent revolution can beat. Because sometimes, a single mark changes your entire destiny.